Thank you. I said to Dr. Roberts backstage, I said, who is not only someone I admire but also a friend of mine, I said, I'm going to speak very briskly because I think it's more interesting for us to have a colloquy rather than my endless soliloquy. Conversation is just there's more to it. And he goes, you said that last time. Which I vaguely remember being true. The last time I spoke at one of these events was 2 years ago this week. And it was just great. And Kevin called me and asked me to do it. I hate think tanks. It's like the main thing I hate in the world, other than Heritage. But I was just grateful to be asked and anxious to come for two reasons. One, I really believed in him and his leadership, and I mean that. In fact, if you knew how mean I was to most think tank people, like, it's embarrassing how mean I am. But it's totally heartfelt, the rage. But I really felt that because they take all this money from the nicest people in America and they don't do anything. Or they become so in love with their own dumb ideas that they don't notice that those ideas turn out to be wrong. But to see someone like Kevin Roberts running Heritage, I was like, wow, that's like the perfect combination of the biggest, the most powerful, the best funded, the most famous think tank in the United States, and leadership that's alive to the effects, to the consequences of those ideas, like leadership that cares about the country it supposedly represents. And I was just thrilled when he took over. And also I felt a personal debt to Heritage because they gave me my first job when nobody else would, and I was not a college graduate and totally unemployable, and I was facing down, this marriage to this girl. I was 21, and her dad is, a nice man, but a man of, rectitude and sort of old-fashioned values like boys who marry my daughter should be employed. And he's like, you gotta have a job, and I hadn't even considered that. So, and I just couldn't get one. No one wanted to hire me, despite my charm and everything. And but Heritage did. I will admit, at the request of my father, but whatever, they did. It doesn't matter. We'll pay him $14,000, okay? And but it completely changed my life. And to hear the John Von Cannon Award, it made me a little emotional. I knew John Von Cannon very, very well, and I won't even tell you why because it's embarrassing. But I spent a lot of time with him when I worked at Heritage in 1991 and 92, and he was just a wonderful man, just a really, really wonderful man. So it was great to hear his name tonight. But anyway, so I've always loved Heritage and felt this great debt of gratitude. So I went 2 years ago this week, and I did something I never do, which is I taped my show. I hate tape. I like live. I was like, whatever, it's a Friday night. I'll do a better show Monday. And so that turned out to be the last show I ever did on TV or ever will do. And when I got fired on Monday morning at 11, with no warning at all, someone said to me, I think it was the speech you gave at Heritage. And honestly, I kind of think it may have been, and I'm not even joking. So I'd never given a speech and mentioned my views, then very quickly evolving views on spiritual warfare. I'm totally unqualified to weigh in on that subject still even, but I was beginning to realize that the things I was seeing were not sort of the product of the political process that I had grown up with, that there was something much bigger going on. And I gave that voice in a not particularly articulate way, but totally sincere way in that speech. And I never thought I would ever talk like that in public or even in private. I just don't come from a world where talking about your sex life or your religious views is considered acceptable at all. And so I don't think I've ever said that to anybody, even my wife of 35 years. I would never talk about that stuff. It's just too personal. But I did, and there were people who didn't like it all. I'm not saying that's why I got fired, but I did get fired hours later. And so I was grateful for it then. I'm even more grateful for it now, not because I'm mad at my former employer. They were always great to me. I'll never criticize them because they were kind to me. But I'm so grateful not to work there, not as grateful as my wife, who, my sweet wife, and when I called her, she was walking the dogs, and I said, I just got fired. And she goes, why? I said, I don't know. They didn't tell me. She goes, I'm so glad. Thank God. So anyway, so I will keep this super short. I really just have one observation before we have the promised colloquy with Dr. Roberts, which is something that he and I and his wonderful wife, I don't have my glass on, but it's sitting right here, right there, we're talking about right before we went on, which is I feel like I've come to this in the last couple of weeks. I feel like we see the world in kind of photographic negative in the following way. If I'm 55, almost 56, if you grew up in this country, you had all these assumptions about the way things worked and about the nature of our institutions, the intent of our institutions, the character of the people who ran them. And so the last, say, 10 years, the great revealing, has been really very, very, very shocking, I think, for a lot of us. And maybe you don't have this experience. I have it every single day, where I'm like, I literally can't believe how evil this is. I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe that someone would do this to the people he's in charge of. I mean, the only really relevant criterion for leadership is love for the people you're leading. And that love has grown cold, clearly, to quote the New Testament. And we see it everywhere. The love of the leaders for their people has grown cold. And there's no other explanation for what we're seeing every single day. How could you treat people like this? Well, you don't love them. That's why. That's the actual answer. And that's just so shocking to me. And it's like one of those things, maybe this is middle age, where I just never get tired of being shocked. It's like watching the same horror movie. And when they're like, it's coming from inside the house, I'm like, no way! Really? Like every single time. I'm like a dog looking out the window, just like endlessly fascinated with the same house. Wow. And I think a lot of us feel that way. And that's on us. Because actually, the deep truth is, the enduring truth, the spiritual truth is, that's what the world is, actually. And it's always been that way, because we know who's in charge of it. And so really, the thing that we ought to be shocked by, delighted by, thrilled by, brought to our knees by, are the constant intrusions of good and decency and holiness into our world, which are all around us. We spend I'll speak for myself, I spend way too much time being horrified by things I should have expected in the first place. I can't believe the Boy Scouts are corrupt. Oh, come on. USAID really was like funding that? Of course it was. What do you think? What I really should be shocked by are those rare moments, those flashes of hope and of kindness between people, and of decency and selflessness and people putting themselves on the line for the sake of other people, which is the definition of love. Those are the things that I should be thinking about when I fall asleep at night, not running behind my eyelids the endless replay of the horror movie of U.S. government or global affairs or whatever. Of course, it's always been that way. It was that way in Rome, ancient Mesopotamia. It's never not been that way. We should be focused on the moments when hope intrudes on that horror movie. And one of them was this last election, which is like crazy unexpected in a million ways. I'm not going to replay it for you because all of you watched it so carefully, and I'm certainly not going to imply that the election of a politician to office is like the coming of the Savior. It's not, obviously. I'm not saying that. But I am saying it could have gone in a number of directions, and it went in the best possible direction. And that is a sign of hope, and that is something to remember as you watch carefully and you see people being people, promises not kept, people being flawed and disappointing, maybe even in some cases controlled, or whatever is actually happening. But you look at people and go, I'm so disappointed you're not perfect, which is how I feel. I'm from the Perfection Caucus. Maybe that's why I once worked at a think tank. And that is not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it is, all things being equal, we head right down the drain. And the very familiar cycle of chaos and, yes, violence ensues, because that's what happens when societies collapse. People hurt each other physically. And we could have gone there, and we may still, but we aren't now. And we should be so grateful for that. That is an answer to prayer. And again, I'm not saying anyone in office is like a holy person who's going to redeem your sins or anything like that. I hate it when people imply that, when the televangelists are implying that you're going to go to heaven by voting for someone. That is false religion. But it's also false religion to ignore the reality around you. And when you are saved from certain destruction, it's your duty to be thrilled by it and grateful for it. And we should be. And we should keep that in mind, I think. And the last thing I'll say, in a much more sort of breaking news temporal frame, is that the Perfection Caucus, of which I am a charter member, I just want to say that, because I live not in the real world. I've never had actual power or a command of an army. I've certainly never been elected to anything. That would never happen. I've only sat on the sidelines and sniped at the people who are actually playing the game, which I really would recommend to all because there's no downside in criticizing people from afar with zero skin in the game. I mean, it really is, you're like a bookie. You get paid either way. It's awesome. But it's so easy to be from the Perfection Caucus, and you're like, wait a second, I thought that you were going to change human nature for the better when you got elected, and you only got 30% there. I hate you. And it's even easier if you live in Washington, particularly if you're in one of the more scholarly institutions in Washington, like a think tank, to decide that your ideas supersede reality, which is actually what a lot of them believe. And I've been affiliated with other, God bless you, other think tanks. I'm not going to name any of them, Cato. And, sorry. I hope you didn't hear that. But to fall in love with your ideas, which, by the way, probably have some merit. I mean, I'm certainly not attacking all. I mean, there are a lot of great ideas out there. But it's one thing to date them. It's another thing to marry them. You know what I mean? Like, hook up, okay, but no long-term commitments. Because what you care about is people and the physical and spiritual reality of their lives. Are they thriving or are they not? A lot of ways to measure this. The one I like is life expectancy, suicide rate, like the bottom line numbers. Do we have a dead body or don't we? Can't lie about that. And by that measure, and a million others, not doing so great. And so the test of wisdom, I would say, of anybody who seeks to weigh in on the way an organization or a country is managed is, do they pay attention to the actual effects? Are they aware of reality? Are they aware of people? And just to give you one small example is why I'm proud to be here tonight. I happened to be in Washington at the large white building on Pennsylvania Avenue last Wednesday, just totally by chance, when the president gave his tariff press conference in the Rose Garden. And I was sitting in the office in the building of someone who used to work for me, so I had access to his office, and we're talking. He's like, oh, the president's talking about tariffs. Flip it on. And I have long ago abandoned any kind of orthodoxy about, well, anything really, other than I'm pro-life and pro-God. That's kind of it. But unlike a lot of the, economic theories, it's like, I don't know, I just want people to thrive, actually. I want to do what works, actually. So that's where my head is. But so deep is my ideological training. I've been in Washington since I was 15. And I'm such a free markets guy that I watched the president talk about tariffs. And I was like, that's the most shocking thing. If he'd taken his clothes off, I wouldn't have been more shocked. Because if you grew up like I did, if you go right from not graduating college to working at the Heritage Foundation, the one thing you know is tariffs are bad. You're not exactly sure why they're bad, but they caused the Great Depression. Come on. And we're just taught that. And you believe it. And that is an unexamined line in our catechism on the right. And I've never thought to re-examine it really. And I thought I had kind of defeated all those stinky orthodoxies inside myself, but of course I hadn't, because I saw him say it. I was like, oh my gosh, tariffs! And then I stilled my heart, and I checked how Heritage was reacting. Because, that is the test. So you have a whole bunch of ideas, a whole suite of ideas, which I have had, and I still have a whole bunch of ideas that I'm sure are completely wrong, because I haven't been forced to test them against reality, and I don't really want to, because it's embarrassing when I do. And the Heritage response, I was like, man, any conservative economist in Washington, what is that paper they put out that people I can't even remember the name of it, the one that, Wall Street Journal. Really, just say as someone who spent 35 years in the news business, I don't read any of them, of course. I would trust the New York Times for the Wall Street Journal. I'm just saying that. Because at least it is what it is. It's just like, we're the New York Times, we hate you. They did a 5-part series on how I was a Nazi. I was like, okay, I get it, Wall Street Journal is incredibly deceptive. But anyway, everyone believes all that stuff in D.C. Sorry, I know I'm hurting everyone's feelings, but it's just a fact. I know the people who work there. And Heritage is like, no, actually, we're going to pause. We're going to think through, what the best way to do this is. We think there are actual problems. We're going to suspend our long-standing ideology for a minute and try to let reality guide our response. We're going to think about what's best for the country. We're going to keep our minds open just for a second. If he screws up, we're going to try and help. We may even, if he keeps screwing up, criticize him, which he will deserve if he keeps screwing up. But for right now, we are going to put people before our pre-existing beliefs. Not our principles. Not our principles. We're not going to compromise. I don't think people with integrity ever compromise their principles. but they do adjust their theories. If the intended and hoped-for outcome doesn't materialize, if you think that your ideas are going to result in prosperity and happiness, and instead they result in a declining life expectancy in a hollowed-out country, an honest person asks himself, like, where did I go wrong? And only Heritage did that. I don't think they're having these conversations over at AEI. Are they? Let me just say unequivocally, no, they're not, and they never will. And by the way, until AEI, which I'm going to pronounce that way for the rest of my life, I worked in that building for 5 years, 17th and L, the people at AEI will, even as their building is being torched by angry mobs of starving people, will blame the starving people. There's no doubt about it, because that's just who they are, which is to say, horrible. And decent people care about the effects of the recommendations that they're handing to others. And I have no idea where this tariff thing is going, but none of us do. But wise people wait to see and then to pass judgment. And Heritage has done that. And I know this may seem, if you're not involved in like DC, debates or think tank world, it may seem like a small thing. It's not a small thing. It's a huge thing. So God bless you for that. Anyway, thank you. And with that, actually, we'll stop and speak to Dr. Kevin Roberts, ladies and gentlemen.
How about another round of applause for great talk? Really, I mean, full disclosure, I just want a round of applause because it actually was kind of short. Yep. I'm grateful.
Well, once I started attacking the Wall Street Journal and AEI, I was like, I should probably stop now because I'm just like lost all the goodwill in the room, but I couldn't control myself because it's true.
I sense a lot of agreement. It's Lent, so I try not to take any pleasure in that. I think that's Bill Chapin's laugh, if I had to identify it. Yeah, all right. Look, Tucker, you're a great friend of Heritage, personal friend, which I'm grateful for. I'm really grateful that, given what happened 2 years ago, you're willing to sit on stage with me.
No, I have no jobs left to be fired from. Like, I'm done.
All kidding aside, how do you think the administration's doing thus far? And by that, it's not really so much a policy question. In fact, it's not a policy question at all. It's really a question about communication, leadership, meeting the moment, and this thing that you remind us of tonight that you do often in your show and you have for years, which is the affection that any leader ought to have for his or her countrymen. How do you see the country responding to Trump and Vance's leadership thus far?
Well, I mean, it's been remarkable, as you know, so remarkable, and this shows what a dark Scandinavian soul I have. I'm waiting for something awful to happen. But, no, it's been remarkable. And, I mean, there are, of course, many criticisms you could level at any living person, including this or any other president or the people who work for him, because they're people, so they're flawed. But in general, I know this to be true. The president is motivated by a gut-level love of, like, America. You don't actually eat that much McDonald's by accident. You do it because you really love it. And McDonald's, which, I don't eat, I try not to, but like that is the heart of America. I'm sorry, everyone knows that. It's just true. And for good or bad. And he's just like face first in America. It's just the way he is. He loves the way it smells. The whole country. He really does. And you'd be like, well, he's an out-of-touch rich guy. That's not really true. So I do think he is motivated by, well, probably by a lot of things. By the quest for glory, like all politicians are. By a deep desire to prove his critics wrong. Most men are driven by that, I can say. I certainly am. And all those people called me a loser when I failed out of college, et cetera. But so that's true, too. But also, and an outrage that his beloved country is being taken advantage of. That's a recurring theme for 40 years with Trump. But also there's a sense like Trump just likes the country. He likes the people. And I've talked to him so much about it in private, and that's totally real. So I think that conveys. There are things, particularly in tariffs, I think, there are certain people in the administration who do a better job explaining it. And, there are some who really don't, who should never be on TV again. To name one example. But in general, I think they've done a great job. And, of course, in my opinion, it's super obvious that they're focused on what matters, which is the rivalry between East and West. They don't want it to become a war. But the central fact of this moment is the rise of China. That is 100 years from now, the books will be about the rise of China and the transfer of power from one empire to another. So that's like big picture what's actually happening. But the two areas that could stop all progress and really hurt the United States are the emergence of larger wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And so my personal view, I'm biased because I've thought this for a long time, but the degree to which this administration is able to resolve those conflicts peacefully will be the grounds upon which it will be judged. If they can't, it's not going to work, and it'll wreck this country. And if they can, it'll be a remarkable administration, like one of the greatest in American history. So it's that simple to me, and I'm praying for and doing everything I can to see those things resolved.
I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. So if you're in the audience, you have a question, be thinking about it. I'll ask this one, and it is, what do you think happens? It's sort of a prediction question. If the Trump-Vance administration get most of the policy questions right, if they get the tariff refinement right, which I think they probably will, and the economy doesn't crater, what happens in the midterms, what happens in 2028, but more importantly than that, I think, is what happens in the 2030s and 40s, and what do we need to be doing right now, we collectively, average people who have a nose for politics, in order to make that happen?
The number one thing every parent needs to do is make sure his or her children are not destroyed by college. So that's just number one. And more people I know, good, decent people, I'm sure people in this room have literally lost children to college. Like, that's it. No longer really your child, meaningfully. And the stakes just couldn't be higher. You lose your child. And this happened to many people I know. And so that's number one. Keep your family strong, your children in the tribe. And I think people feel that instinctively. People feel that we're entering a totally new period. Clearly we are. And just because there's a lot of turmoil doesn't mean, as I do a Christmas letter or New Year's letter to my family every year. We all meet, whatever, for cocktails because we're Protestants, and we read this letter. And every year I have the same sort of bottom line observation, which is the world is like completely out of control, but our family is thriving, and that's what matters. And I think that's just the bottom line truth for every person, is how are my people doing? And because it is a series of concentric circles of obligation, and you do have deep obligation to your nation and to your neighbors, but your first obligation is to your family. That's number one, period. And I don't think that you meet obligations out of turn. My first obligation is to my wife, then to my children. Okay, it's really that simple. Then to my sibling, my parents, my nephews, you know what I mean? Then my college roommates, my employees, then my neighbors. It goes out like that, like a ripple in a pond. And so the first concern is, how is my family doing? And as I always say to my wife, when she's like, I can't believe how crazy things are, it's like, people are probably really happy, some people, during the fall of Rome. They like Germans. It wasn't a problem for them. Oh, the Germanic tribes, I like those guys. So, just keep the people close to you close. That's the number one thing. I mean, honestly, I think nothing matters if you don't do that. And now I say one thing super quick. J.D. Vance is the future. Period. And you'll never hear me say nice things about politicians. I know them all. There are very few I like. Eric Schmidt's one of them, by the way, just for whatever it's worth. He's a very decent man. Mike Lee is a very decent man. I'm sure there are a few others. There aren't a ton, honestly. They're mostly, yeah, I like Rick. But most of them are kind of what you think they are. Actually, they're way worse than you think they are. And ask their wives, But J.D. Vance is the best I've ever met, ever. He's the combination of intelligence, decency, wisdom, emotional self-control. I don't have that. It's incredible. He's incredible. And genuine affection for Trump and loyalty to Trump is not a pose. He actually really likes Trump. Thinks Trump's an amazing person. They get along really well. It's not fake. And so that's just thrilling for me that there's someone like that. The Republicans have not had that. I don't know how many people were sort of betting on Mike Pence. Sorry. But they don't tend to, politicians don't, the big politicians, they don't want a rival near them. It takes a lot. Trump has changed a lot. to hire someone like J.D. Vance, who's 40 years old and really smart. It's incredible. So anyway, I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but that's just something to be really happy about, hopeful for, I think.
Appreciate the response, and by that, putting politics in proper perspective. We're going to turn to the audience for questions. Raise your hand if you have a question. Colleagues will come around with a question right over there. Lindsay's heading that direction. Nope. Mary, someone. Keep your hand raised. Excellent. Thank you.
I'm curious to ask a sort of wonky question, but what do you make of separation of powers, both in terms of President Trump and in terms of how important that is to the country?
Well, I've always loved separation of powers. I mean, I think it's a basis of our form of government. So because you don't want to vest too much power in any individual, because we know what human nature is, which is modeled at best. So that's a kind of core question. But you also don't want to wind up with judicial tyranny, which can happen and has happened around. It's happening in Romania right now. It's happening in Brazil right now. People I know, where one Supreme Court justice threw a bunch of people in jail, including a friend of mine. So everything's a balance. It's not a question of neutering the judiciary. Congress has basically been neutered, by the way. They've self-castrated. They're like transitioning or something. They've relinquished all their powers to the executive because they're cowards.
You have a way with words.
Oh, sorry. But anyway, sorry, not to. Woo! Thank you, doctor, for reining it in. No, it's just a sensible balance. I mean, look, people need to behave sensibly, or they devalue their own moral authority. And so, if some unelected judge decides he runs America, it's important to say, no, you don't. And you yourself are sort of challenging the legitimacy of the system by overreaching. Do you know what I mean? That's all I'm saying. But it doesn't mean that you're against judges. You want judges. You want balance. Just like a marriage. If one partner decides to steamroll the other partner, I don't care what you think, well, that's not workable, actually. Everybody has a role to play. Everyone has a voice. You have to treat people seriously, but in order to be treated seriously, you have to act like a serious person. So I do hope that we have judges forever in this country. I hope they're taken seriously, and I hope they behave seriously. And I hope when they don't behave seriously, they're squashed like insects.
Yes, question right here. Microphone's coming up. Joe, hold on just a minute.
Very much on evening news.
Thank you.
Question, are you ever coming back to evening news?
First
Katie,
of all, thank
don't go
you
far.
So much. The question about going back to evening news. I don't think evening news is coming back. So I don't think whether we're sitting, by the way, I don't want to embarrass him or call him out by name or point to him sitting right there in a red tie. That's the former president of Fox News. He was a wonderful man and my friend. No,
he hired you, right?
Yeah, not only hired me, supported me, and paid me fairly and commiserated with me. Yeah, it was like when he left. That's when, But anyway, I'm not going to name him Bill Shine with his wife Darla. But
how about a round of applause?
Yeah,
for Bill
ladies
Shine?
and gentlemen, Bill Shine. It's really a question for him who's actually run a big news company, the biggest news company. But my sense is consumer habits are changing. That's a product of both technology, the audience aging out, but it's also on some deep level what happens when you devalue your own credibility, when you commit suicide by lying too much. And, people will watch television. We have a TV app. We get millions of viewers on TVs, but we're not a television network. We don't have any investors. We own it. My college roommate and I own the company that we work for. No one can exert influence on us. We've got a bunch of advertisers. None of them have more than 5% of our revenue. It's like we're not controlled. And I think that's the key right now in the news environment, is not always to be right. I'm often wrong. Obviously, I endorsed the Iraq War. I mean, I have many shameful moments in my history, in my past. However, I'm not controlled. I try to be honest, and I think that is the key right there. If people think you're trying to get it right, you aren't telling lies on behalf of someone they've never heard of, they can smell that, they can feel it, and you will succeed. And you can't really be like that in TV because you are controlled for a bunch of different reasons. So I just do think that medium is going away, in my view.
Thanks for the question. We've got a question here. Katie, if you don't mind, thank you for your patience waiting there. Yes, sir.
My question is, we've all seen the benefits of Doge, and unfortunately it's set to expire next year. So how can we continue those efforts, and how can we advocate for government efficiency throughout, the rest of these administrations?
Well, that's a question I was pondering in the sauna this morning, actually. I love Doge, and I know the guy who's running it, and I love him. I think he's been he's a complicated person, but he's been really a key part of America's renaissance by keeping the First Amendment alive. I'm talking about Elon Musk, to my will always be grateful. But I mean that. But we need to bring Doge to the FBI and the CIA. Let's just be totally honest now, okay? I mean, I've lived in that city my whole life. I had a parent who worked at one of those agencies. Like, I have some sense of how things go. And it's great to humiliate USAID. I'm totally in favor of that. But you just tanked the economy of Vienna, Virginia when you did that. Okay, because actually all this stuff is a money laundering scheme. The Ukraine war, USAID, it's all about supporting people in the D.C. metro area. Obviously, if you live there, you know that that's true, because it is true. However, the real power centers in the U.S. government, let me just say, are CIA, DOJ, Pentagon. Okay, that's where the power is. That's where the money is. That's where the good things happen. That's also where the bad things happen. I'm not, not a blanket attack on everyone who works at those agencies. Of course, I know a million of them, and they're great people and patriotic people, decent people, Christian people. But there are a lot of really bad actors, and none of them have been fired. And, what the hell is that? And that's a very unwise thing, even for self-preservation reasons. You know what I mean? It's like I could go on for literally hours on this topic, but I won't. I'll just say we need to bring Doge to where the power and the money are. And that's not the Department of Education, which I'd be happy to see, bulldozed for a dog park. But that's not going to save the country. You need to, after everything that happened after, January 6th, during the first Trump term, many people I know went to jail, many, on totally trumped up charges. They tried to put Trump in jail on nonsense charges. And no one's been fired, really? After everything we've learned about what the intel agencies do, spying on Americans, and it's Ed Snowden who's still stuck in Moscow, and he said just had lunch with him in Moscow. Ed Snowden's wants to come back. He's an American. And I'm sure everyone hates Ed Snowden here, but let's just really quick. The facts are Ed Snowden revealed that U.S. intel agencies were illegally spying on Americans. That's illegal. It's a violation of the Constitution. You can't do that. And not one person was fired, and Ed Snowden gets the death penalty. Now, maybe you're mad at Ed Snowden for he's a traitor or whatever, but what about the people who are spying on you using your tax dollars, treating you like a foreign enemy? And they're rich? Like, what? It enrages me. And the last thing I'll say is they are rich. And this is a topic I know a lot about. And they're rich. There's a lot of money flowing through. And I don't mean sort of rich. I mean like beachfront property, $20 million house rich. And I know them personally. I sold one of my houses to them once. And it's a massive, massive problem. And everybody in D.C. knows it. And no one's doing anything about it. And why is that? Well, partly because they're afraid. And that tells you everything right there. If you're afraid of government bureaucrats, like literally afraid, like, oh, can't touch that, then that's like Idi Amin level corruption. And that has to be addressed.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned the war in Eastern Europe, and you also mentioned the war in the Middle East. What do you personally see as an acceptable off-ramp and conclusion to the war in Eastern Europe, and also an acceptable off-ramp and conclusion to the war in the Middle East?
Well, now you're trying to make me unpopular. Okay, since you asked, I'll tell you. The first thing to know about the war against Russia is it was a war against Russia, and we lost. That's just a fact, okay? This was a war by the Biden administration against Russia, a regime change war against Russia that was sold to the public as a defense of Ukraine. That is a lie. Ukraine's been completely destroyed. The government of Ukraine changed the law in Ukraine to allow the land of Ukraine, the farmland, to be sold to foreigners, which it has been. The population of Ukraine has either left or been killed. So in 20 years, there will not be Ukraine. And I say this as someone who knows a lot of Ukrainians, and I have 2 Ukrainians who work for me, like nice people in the world. Christian Ukrainians are like the most decent people I've ever met. So it's not any animus toward Ukrainians, it's just the opposite. It's a love of Slavic peoples in general. I just like. So there's that. But it was a war against Russia. Now, why? That's a whole separate topic. I can only speculate. But they're totally intent on breaking up Russia and deposing its leader. Now, whether that's wise or not, we could debate. But that was the idea. That was the only idea. And they lost, after over 3 years, the full might of NATO, which was formed in 1947 as a bulwark against Russia. So it failed. So Russia won, whether we wanted to, and I didn't want Russia to win. I don't want NATO to be exposed as weak. How's that good for me as an American? It's not, but that happened. And Russia could eliminate Ukraine in 1 second using conventional hypersonic weapons. Like Kiev could be gone. That's just a fact. So in war, the victor sets the terms. And it's only because, for whatever reason and calculation Putin has made, he hasn't said that out loud. But that fact is known to anybody who's rational. We don't get to set the terms. And so the best we can hope for, Russia does not want to take, west of the river in Ukraine, or they would have, and they could. There's nothing we can do about it short of going nuclear, period. We've exhausted a huge percentage. I mean, there's a debate over what percentage, but massive percentage of our conventional stockpile fighting that war and lost. So, I've made this case public and private many times. So the best we can do, and there are all kinds of complicated problems, like, but I won't get bored. It won't be boring, but it's harder to unwind than it looks, because what do you do with all these weapons in Ukraine, many of which have been sold to lunatic groups around the world by the Ukrainian military, including Hamas and the Mexican drug cartels. So it's a huge, huge problem that will not be fully resolved for generations, and it's a very sad thing. But it has to be fixed, and soon, and we need to fix it with that posture. And Steve Witkoff, who's the president's friend and now global envoy, is the best equipped person I can imagine. He's the last person I ever would have chose, and it shows that Trump really does have this weird kind of genius where he can see things. Witkoff is one of my favorite people. I knew him before, just flat out amazing person. And I could go on, but I won't. Anyway, so that needs to be fixed. It's not simply a question of what to do with Iran's nuclear program and can you actually do anything about it, which is a real question, actually, that no one wants to admit out loud. But there are mathematical ways to figure out what your limits are. And one of the ways is you take the number of ballistic missiles an enemy has, and you subtract from that the number of anti-ballistic missiles that you and your allies have, and you can understand very quickly the damage that they could do to you. And by that calculation, Iran, I know everyone's like, their air defenses are down. Well, we don't really know that, actually. We think that's partly true. But the fact is, Iran could kill a lot of people, American troops at the dozens of U.S. military bases in the Gulf, and could really hurt Israel in a way that all of us who think Israel's a great country don't want to see. So it's a little bit more complicated, just that we bring in some B-2s and send some bunker busters in and blow up the 6 nuclear sites, which, by the way, sit on what? The Persian or Arabian, depending on what side you're on, Gulf, which is the water supply for the 6 Gulf countries. It's desal. Where do you think their water comes from? They don't have any water in UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman. They don't have any water. It's desal. So you blow up those nuclear sites, and that Gulf is contaminated by nuclear material. There's no water in the world's richest oil-producing countries and our allies, okay? Then if you close the end of it, the eastern side of it, called the Straits of Hormuz, which is like less than 100 miles across between Iran and Oman, you don't have any oil exports out of there. And you've got $25 a gallon gasoline or whatever it is. We've got some oil people here who could be more precise. You have at very least major disruption in energy markets. It's like totally real. And I can't speculate. Oil is so complex in its pricing. I don't understand it, but I don't think there's a single oil person who would say that's not going to cause a shock that's going to have big-time economic effects, okay? So there's just a lot of different factors that don't go into the descriptions you read about or see in the Wall Street Journal because they're written by ideologues and dumb people who don't know. This stuff's super complicated, and war has got to be your final option because and I'm not even getting into the bottom line fact that every American should meditate on, which is that Iran is not by itself anymore. And the main effect of the insane Ukraine war, which the Biden administration started on purpose, fact, is to drive Russia into close alliance with China. And if you don't believe it, go to Moscow, which you can still do. I've done it twice recently. And it's the richest city in the world. It's the nicest city you've been in. And you're like, wait a second. I thought we had these radical sanctions. We kicked them out of SWIFT. They're in the middle of a war. They've lost hundreds of thousands of men. How is Moscow, and also I've been all over the country, how is it so rich? Because they're being backstopped by China, Dumbo. That's how. I finally realized this because I'm not a genius. They are now part of an alliance that includes the overwhelming majority of the world's economy and the overwhelming majority of the world's population and landmass. They're all aligned against us. And Iran is part of that. Iran is a major energy supplier to China. So it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's like without even realizing it, we're in a position that's very different from the position we were in even 10 years ago. Very, very different. And it's very sad. And this country's been systematically weakened by bad leadership, bipartisan bad leadership. And it leaves us with fewer options. So now is the time, this is just my view. I don't have a super straightforward answer to your question other than tread slowly, send Steve Witkoff, who's the single most talented, naturally talented diplomat I've ever met, as the son of a diplomat. I can, been around a lot of diplomats. Witkoff is just the guy who always wants to get to some kind of reasonable compromise, whom everybody just instinctively likes. Find an enemy of Steve Witkoff doesn't exist. And he's tough, and he's very pro-American, very patriotic, and he loves Trump. And so I have great hopes he's meeting directly with the Iranians. They had no direct talks. They had no direct talks with the Russians. They had no direct talks with the Iranians. What's the point of that exactly? And the number of times I've been called a secret Shiite or something. No, I'm an Episcopalian, not a Shiite. And I'm a liberal now. I'm not a liberal. I just don't understand, other than you getting rich, what's the point of having a war that you could avoid in favor of further peace and prosperity and maintaining global trade routes and all the benefits of not having nuclear war, like staying alive and stuff. So, but for some reason, the culture of D.C. hates people who say that more than any other person. Any other person. People having gay sex in a committee room in the Senate, no problem. On video, no problem. But the guy who stands up is like, maybe we don't have a war today. What? Putin puppet! And I basically destroyed my career saying that. Of course, I found a much happier, better career. But that's really why I got booted, was saying stuff like that. They hate you for that. And there are a lot of reasons, and I'll stop with this. The main reason everyone points to is money. There's a ton of money. Of course, that's true. It's a money laundering scheme. Where is all the money? There's never been an audit of we don't even know, $200 billion, whatever we sent to Ukraine. We have no idea. So people did get rich on it, legit rich. You can visit Zelensky at his place in Miami Beach sometime. Maybe you will. You paid for it. But the real reason is deeper and darker than that, and that's that killing people is just a basic human desire along with sex and eating. That's just true. It's a fact. That's in every single one of us. There's not a person in this room who hasn't been so mad as I'd kill that person. There's not a single person who hasn't fantasized at some point against his own wishes about violence and a lot of other ugly things. But that's one of the things that is in every person, that homicidal tendency. And there's no pure expression of power than killing. And having spent, again, my whole life in D.C., I can promise you that's the main thing that people care about. They don't care about Head Start or Social Security or whatever. It's, the Republicans on the Intel Committee want to be involved in killing people because it makes them feel powerful. And their wives may not respect them at home, but when they're in charge of human life, that's a thing. And that's the impulse that you're defeating. And, there was a historical figure, actually, who took a pretty hard stand against that. And when, one of his disciples took out a sword and cleaved off the ear of the Roman centurion or the Sanhedrin's bodyguard, he said, nope. And, he pretty quickly got killed after that. There is from the beginning of time, the guy who stands up and says, hey, let's not commit murder today has always been murdered. But it doesn't mean we have to keep doing that. That's a last resort at best. So that's my view. Sorry.
Thank you. Then thanks for the questions. Bottom line, pray for Steve Witkoff.
He's the best, man. Yeah. I never thought I would say this, but he's the best.
Thanks, Tucker. We'll take one more question right over here.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts and Tucker. Dr. Roberts has said that we're in a new revolution, and the revolution of 1776 was either at the same time or preamble to or followed the Great Awakening in America. is there an opportunity for a new great awakening, for a spiritual revival, like that guy who healed that man who lost his ear?
I mean, we are in the middle of it. We are just in the middle of it, and I am like the last person to ask on this subject because I'm just from such a, what's the phrase used, different religious tradition. So I'm like not an expert on this stuff, but I just see it all around me everywhere. It's unbelievable. The one thing that, as I said it in my remarks, that we never talked about in my family or the culture I grew up in was religious faith or spirituality. I mean, that was like, we have religious cousins in Texas, and we would always make fun of them. They all turned out to be like happy and prosperous and long married, and now I'm spending Easter with them this year. But like, I just didn't grow up around that. And so now I find every single day someone will come up to me and start telling me about God, sometimes in like halting, in the way that people who haven't grown up talking about God talk, well, I guess like me, in this sort of slightly awkward, stilted way. They're trying to explain something, whereas an evangelicalist come up and like fluently tell you what you know what I mean? Oh, that's Ephesians 9. But what I'm saying is people who didn't grow up with it, who haven't spent their lives thinking about God, are all around me. It's insane. Are clearly responding to something they're hearing inside. And the last thing I will say is that is the divide. It really is. That is the divide. You were wondering, like, what happened during COVID when totally reasonable people became, like, filled with hate and angry? And then some people became like braver and bigger and kinder and less about themselves and more about other people and just sort of glowed with this holy joy. I'm sure you saw that. We all saw that. It was the dividing line. It was like no one was in the middle. And that has not decelerated. It's accelerated, not because of COVID or any political issue or even because of Trump. It's just this great divide is going on. You can feel it. I was literally pulling out this morning. This is so dorky in my golf cart because I'm in Florida. And I ran into the guy who's, trimming the trees. And he stops me. He's like, oh, man, I've been wanting to talk to you. And I've been reading the Bible. It's like a random guy. And my father just died. And he's like, I heard your father died. I'm so sorry. All of a sudden, I was like, I was so emotional. Like, I had this, like, wild connection with this, like, crazed landscaper from Wisconsin. And anyway, I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying other than that happens to me every single day. And that's never happened to me for the first 53 years of my life. Like, what is going on? And so maybe the last Great Awakening was, famously symbolized by the tent revival. I think that's not happening now. Maybe it's the X revival. I don't know. Like, it's a cliche, but it's true. God works in ways that we don't anticipate and that we don't recognize at first. But we know that something really wild that we're not creating is happening. And I definitely see it every single day.
We covered a lot of ground. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the responses, Tucker. One bit of housekeeping before we conclude. As soon as we're done, we'll have a dessert reception outside. So make your way out there. We'll see you out there. Look forward to conversations. Would you join me one more time in thanking Tucker Carlson for everything that he does?
Thank you.